Brian, welcome back. Season 6 of I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist, and people can see us. I can see you, you can see me, and others can see us. So we have to be really careful not to pick our nose.
Well, I might pick my nose amongst other things that I may pick. They'd be picking all round. Hey, we've had a decent break, haven't we?
We have had a decent break. It's been a really long break, but I've really enjoyed it because God knows, not that he exists, that I needed it.
God does know. If he existed, correct. Hey, let me give you a very quick update about something. I just went across to my partner's home state of South Australia for the weekend for a family event. Anyway, I've found out my partner is surrounded by fundamentalists. So on her dad's side and her mum's side. So we went out to lunch with family on the Saturday, all fundies. One started witnessing to my father-in-law. My father-in-law is an atheist. Told him just shut him down, basically. A party on Saturday night, went to my partner's auntie's 70th. Her brother gave her a women's study Bible with inspirational quotes, bound in leather. And she
Can you
too,
see my expressions? I'm making expressions because we're on video.
I can see your expressions. See, this is, and you know what? Our listeners and our listeners and our lookers can see it as well. But yeah, how's that? So she also is an atheist, and but fundies everywhere.
Well,
so
we
anyway,
know that's the way it is, isn't it? There are fundies everywhere. There's always been fundies everywhere, and we used to be part of the everywhere.
Look, I think it's like when you get a yellow car, you start seeing yellow cars everywhere. Maybe that's what it is.
Or it's like having a Tesla. You start hating Elon Musk and wish you didn't have a Tesla.
Yeah, he's a fucker.
Yeah. There's bumper stickers that you can get now that say things like, I drive a Tesla, but I hate Elon, or I bought this car before he went crazy and shit like that.
Tempted to get one, but I won't. I'll just shout from the rooftops that he is a fuckwit.
Yes, and he is. So, Brian, let's get into it because I know people get a bit bored when we ramble. And not that we rambled. I mean, hopefully people are like, hey, we haven't heard from you in however long, and it's so great to have you back and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, here we are. But we've decided for this episode that we're going to re-examine our conversion stories because it's been 5 seasons, starting our 6th. It's been 4 years since we started the podcast. And that was our first episode, right? Our first 2 episodes. The first episode was you. Second episode was mine. And we told our conversion stories. And I said to you, remember, I said, hey, Brian, how about we do a revisit? Because we've changed in our perspectives so much over the last 4 years that it might be interesting to revisit our conversion stories and see if there's anything sort of different or any new information that we pull out. And if you're playing along at home, please do so and revisit your own conversion story.
And send it in to 1-800. Now, I am going to be interested to talk through this because we do have very different perspectives, I think, from where we were 4 years ago. And just having a look at the lens by which now we hold, which again will probably change, I would imagine, going forward. But where we're at now, what we've learned, and I think those reflective pieces that we've had to employ along the way, it'll be really interesting, I think, to revisit it. So I'm looking forward to this. I'm looking forward to hearing your reflections.
And I'm looking forward to hearing yours. So what we've done is we've got questions that we've written, and we're just going to ask them to each other, right? And just go like we normally do. So I'll start, mate, if that's all right. And I want to ask you, you converted in 1989, which was a pretty good year, I must say, and you were 17. What are some of your strongest memories from that year and your general outlook on life before you converted?
Look, I think I was reasonably happy. My memories of that time obviously, I had all that teenage angst. I think I spoke about this in my conversion story. I was 17, struggling with a place in the world, identity, who are your real friends, what is happening in life. You're about to become an adult technically, for me, I had left school quite early. So I left school at 14. So at 17, I was in the last year of a pastry chef apprenticeship. So for me, I was like, okay, what am I going to do when I'm qualified? Am I going to go and work somewhere else? Am I going to whatever? I'm not quite sure what I was going to do. But I guess for me, it was identity. I had a friendship group. It probably wasn't super tight. I'd shifted friendship groups when I'd started work because a lot of my friends had stayed at school and a lot of them went through to year 12. So when I was 17, a lot of my mates were in year 12 doing their HSC, their high school certificate in Victoria. And so a lot of them were hanging out together. I was hanging around with a lot more friends from work, and I probably had quite a different identity, but I didn't know where I fit. And I was always someone who I was spiritual. That's the way I would probably frame it. And that was because the household I got brought up in, not Christian, not at all, but very open to spirituality. Things like, we'd have seances as, family with siblings and with mum, and mum and dad, not dad, sorry, mum and my sisters would go to clairvoyance. And so I was always open. I was wondering about other stuff in life. And it probably wasn't something that I necessarily shared with friends because friendship groups didn't talk about that stuff at 17, but it was always sitting in the back of my mind. So I was curious, I guess. Curious and maybe a little bit lost, self-esteem, 17, like a normal 17-year-old, but maybe slightly adrift.
Can you remember what music you were listening to? Was that 1927? Was that the year that they did that, or was that 1988?
It was around that time, so ish, 1927.
Yeah.
Lots of Cold Chisel, lots of Australian crawl, lots of Australian music. So as you know, and I'm still into Australian music, I love it. But also at that age, I was into a lot of, it was sort of a 60s revival of music. So a lot of the Doors, Creedence Clearwater Revival, they were ever present in my world and on my Sony Walkman because CDs had not long come out then, and you could whack it in your Sony Walkman and every time you walk, it would jump. The ads weren't true. They did jump. They were shit. But that was definitely for me. That was where I was at and who I was. But for you, what I'm going to ask, because it goes up back further for you, you were, 13, 14 or something when you were converted. So we're going to talk about your time. Who was Troy then? What were your initial interests, experiences? What was shaping you and your place in the world?
I've reflected on a lot of this because I've, done all my sort of therapy and everything around the religion, not just through the podcast, but actual proper therapy. And I think probably the most impactful thing on me at that time is that my family had just moved from America, from Virginia to Canberra in Australia. And so it was a really full-on culture shock. For those that don't know Australia very well, Canberra it's our capital, but it's a very small city. You would even call it a town, very, very small. And so coming from the hubbub of the suburbs of Washington, DC, to all of a sudden being in Canberra, one capital to another, I just didn't cope, and I really didn't enjoy coming back to Australia at that time in my life. It was actually quite traumatic, and I don't use that flippantly. The culture stress was intense. Missing all my music, and coming back to Australia where I was so into heavy metal and Van Halen and Iron Maiden and all these kinds of bands. And I will say that I was into them, but not as much as I was into them when I came back, because I sort of felt pushed to sort of, claim an identity. And that was everything about America, right? And so to me, it was the music that I liked. And I didn't care that people were into, Duran Duran back here, and they were into, rap was a big thing, and kids were rap dancing and stuff. And I was just like, no, I'm from the suburbs of Virginia, and I'm just going to be into this. And so being American was a big part of my identity. And I wouldn't have picked up on that being a really important influence, but I think it did set me up for Pentecostalism and, American evangelicalism, even though I really wasn't super into it before I left. In fact, I wasn't into it at all before I left the US. But yeah, that was me.
At that age, I'd imagine you'd be pretty susceptible to an accent. You'd pick that up pretty
Oh, I
easily.
had a total American accent. 100% I did.
And did you stand out because of that? Were you a kid that was just blended in, everyday Troy, or did you stand out as different?
I certainly, look, you know me, I'm over the top anyway, but with an American accent. And especially in Canberra, at that stage, Canberra in the 80s, America wasn't, they weren't fans of the US. So, yeah, I think it would have been different if we'd moved to Melbourne or if we'd moved to Sydney. But the fact that we went to Canberra, yeah, having an American accent was not a good thing to have. Yeah. So I felt quite isolated, and I made friends with another guy who'd just come back from England. And so he'd lived over in England. So we were sort of like this little bit of an expat friendship. And I mentioned him when I told the story in the other episode. But hey, I've got a question for you. You did mention that it was a significant time for you when we did that interview. So can you elaborate what was happening in your life then? And were there any particular stresses, uncertainties, or longings that you're experiencing? I'm sort of hinting at the idea of vulnerability, right? Because a lot of the models around conversion and cults and stuff talk about people that are going through something are often more susceptible. So would you describe that period as such?
Yeah, look, I think 17, you're pretty vulnerable anyway. I think you're trying to forge a way in life. What's your identity? Who are you? What do you stand for? All of those sort of things, and not from a political standpoint at that age. But I think for me, it was more like, who am I? Where do I fit in? What is going on for me? As I said, I wasn't like a lot of my friends who were still at school. I had left. So I was already in a different space to a lot of people. I was thinking about future before they were even leaving school. I was thinking about my next career step, I guess, and what I was going to do next. So definitely vulnerability. I was probably insecure when I think back on it. Not probably. I was actually quite introverted back then, and I'm probably still an introvert, but then I was a bit more extreme, quite shy, awkward, didn't really know how to communicate well. I wasn't really in a job where you had to communicate either, so I wasn't forced to. But I knew, in some ways, I knew that I was struggling with navigating life, but I probably wouldn't have articulated it that way back then. I just didn't quite know what to do, and I was set adrift by myself a bit because I'm the youngest of 8 children, and I think Mum had forgotten she'd had a 7th, and certainly had forgot she had an 8th. So I was free range, and so I was navigating life myself. I was trying to understand how to actually what's next, and without guidance from parents. My dad was fairly absent, and Mum was working full time as well, and I was one of these kids who sort of come and went as I pleased, and I wasn't really challenged on that. Boundaries were very, very loose, probably by the time I was 11 or 12, let alone 17. By 17, I was definitely acting like most adults would, but without the mindset of an adult. So I didn't really have that guidance, and I didn't really understand at the time what I was actually struggling with. So it was a complex time, and I was a complex person. And look, I remember being very anxious, and that was something I struggled with most of my life. Anxiety's always been something that's been present. But back then, I remember I was worried about everything all the time. I remember being worried about, my parents splitting, because it was always there. I remember being worried about getting cancer. Like, it was bizarre. Like, I'd have these lists of worries and going, what is next? So I was always unsettled. But Yeah, drank a lot. Binge drinking with mates was something that was always there.
You're a super smoker too, weren't you?
I was a very heavy smoker at 17. So by the time I was 17, I was smoking probably 35, 40 cigarettes a day. And on the weekends, maybe up to 60 cigarettes. So I was a very heavy smoker.
Do you remember the number? Because it was 2 packets of Peter Jackson.
I actually
30s.
do. It was Peter Jackson's super mild, so I'd gone from the extra mild. And I remember during the week going, if I went over 1 packet a day, I was like, oh, ease up. But on the weekends, I would be a bit more lax. And I had a job where I could smoke. So smoking in the workplace wasn't frowned upon. So it was an adult world through really a very immature child's brain. So that was me. So definitely, if you're getting at that vulnerability, I was definitely vulnerable. There is absolutely no doubt about it. I just didn't know it at the time. But I'm going to you now. So see what we're doing here, back and forward, and we're going to mix it up a little bit too. You spoke about in your conversion story that you grew up in a family that wasn't necessarily traditionally religious, but there was a priming through your mum being interested in spiritual things. So looking back around this time, so we're talking again 13, 14 years old, what were your feelings around spirituality and belonging?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I've just finished reading a book all about speaking in tongues, which is going to be an episode that we're going to do later. And one of the things that this book was saying is that the Catholic Charismatic Renewal movement, which is basically Penties that, pray to Mary, they sort of brought a lot of the Pentecostal idea on tongues and spirituality and everything mainstream. And it was saying that if it hadn't been for that, it may not have been where it's at today. It's really quite interesting. And I thought, wow, that's my story, because my mother's friend was in the Catholic Charismatic Renewal movement, and she had told my mum all about this stuff. And so, yeah, I definitely told that story in the in my own conversion story that I told when we first started. But I think, like you, I would have considered myself to be spiritual. I was very interested in spiritual things like, astral projection and, end times prophecies and all that kind of stuff. Like when you told your story, I was like, that was totally me. So yeah, I think there was a spiritual interest that was, able to be filled by Pentecostalism. But I think also because my parents had said that we were Christian, that's what we are. We're Christians and we're a Christian family and all that kind of stuff. So I didn't, it wasn't a barrier for me to sort of go, oh, is Christianity true? It's like, no, that's what we are. It's like my parents voted conservative and that's what we were. And that's how it was. And, we're Australian. We're Australian living in America, or we're, Australians living back in Australia. My identity was oftentimes dictated to me by my family. And, fair enough. I think it's true for most people. So I think there was a lot of priming that went on, just by osmosis, but also by the fact that my mother had put this emphasis on tongues and I'd heard her talking, etc. I guess I was looking to belong, coming back to your question, because as I talked about before, I was feeling like a fish out of water with the whole moving back to Australia thing. And so I think I was very much in a vulnerable place. Yeah. And I think that's something that we're both looking at in these questions is, was it a point of vulnerability? 100% it was a point of vulnerability for me and, for you too, I guess.
Well, we were teenagers again, so, prime times of our lives have been vulnerable, I think, at the best of times, let alone with all the other overlays. A lot of that stuff that we've read around that coercion, conversion, control stuff, I guess it seeks to target, whether intentionally or unintentionally, probably intentionally, those that are seeking that bigger picture purpose in life. Was that something that you think that you were seeking at that time? And if so, what was it? Do you know what it was that you're looking for?
I certainly wasn't conscious of it, but I think it was there. You're coming into an age, I was 13, 14, coming into an age where you're starting to say, who am I? What matters to me? Why, not so much thinking, why are we here? But they certainly gave that answer. Here's why you're here. Oh, it's like when the Jehovah's Witnesses come to your door, and say, oh, do you worry about the end times and everything? No, I don't, and then they feed you all this shit. It turns out you start to. So I think I think it was fed to me later on, that it gave me purpose, and maybe as I got older and needed that, it was there, right? It was already, ready, served and everything. But I don't know that I was consciously looking for purpose, not at 13 and 14, but certainly later.
Yeah, I reckon I was the same. Like I never remembered thinking about God. For example, I wasn't brought up in a family that spoke about God or this concept of a creator type God, but we spoke more around, hey, what happens after we die? And what happens in this life? Are we all connected together? And do we have any of that sort of airy-fairy stuff going on? It wasn't talking about God. So it was, it's interesting. Like the concept of God was something that, for me, was introduced by the church.
Mm. Hey, one of the things that we have talked about a number of times is we talked about love bombing, right? We've talked about it. We've heard it. It's, the idea that you get this sort of initial acceptance, you get this welcome, this sort of embrace, albeit metaphorically, by the group. You described the church that you visited with your two brothers as having a good bunch of friends who were incredibly supportive. And you said there was a feeling of acceptance and community that you hadn't felt before. And you've talked about the fact that you were sort of on your own and your parents weren't giving you boundaries and attention and everything. But was there anything that felt particularly intense or overwhelming when you first joined the community, when you first signed up for church?
Yeah, it's funny. Like when I was on holidays and got converted while I was away, I went to both. I went to one brother's church, but I met the other brother's friends, and the other brother's friends didn't make me feel that connected.
Did they go to different churches?
Yeah, they went to different churches. So
that's interesting.
Yeah, and one of them, because one of my brothers was a surfer, so he went to more of a surfer's church, and that was the one when I ended up giving my life to the Lord in. My other brother's church was a little bit more, I wouldn't have been able to articulate it back then, but it was probably a bit more exclusive, I guess, and it wasn't as welcoming. And I probably felt that when I'd met his friends, I just didn't connect. They weren't my people. Whereas when I went to church with my brother, the surfer brother, I just connected. They were just a really lovely bunch of people who I connected with. I did definitely, in hindsight, get love bombed. There was no doubt. However, I think that they were just genuinely also good people who were a lot more laid back and fitted my my needs at the time. So I think that was definitely a difference with the two. I definitely, when I moved into a church after that, back in Melbourne when I came back, I didn't have that experience immediately. I went to, I took breaks away from church. I went back and hung out with mates, and until it probably took 18 months where I settled into a church where I completely got love bombed. I got accepted by everybody, and I just felt at home, like probably back to my brother's church where I'd got saved. I felt that feeling again. It was that connection that I'd been craving, and the thing that got me across the line at that time when I did actually go up the front and pray the prayer, that I felt again at that church. In between, there was definitely, I don't know, there was bouts of love bombing, but it probably wasn't as immersing because they were small little churches and people would come and go and you'd get reached out to by the pastor who, make you feel special. But then 2 weeks later, they were moving on to someone else who was coming through the door, a new convert.
That brings me to the question for you. So speaking of love bombing, because it sounds like it's a tactic, right? It sounds like it's something that people are intentionally doing. Do you think that they're going, oh, we're going to keep this kid in the church by love bombing him? Or do you think it's just you knew and it's like the cultural norm? How do people know to love bomb?
I think you're new and shiny. And part of the culture is if someone new comes in, just make them feel welcome. Do whatever you can to be part of it. And I think that the intention is to accept people. I don't think that they're saying, if we actually love bomb them, we are going to rope them in. We're going to have a better opportunity to be coercive and controlling. I want to be kind and say that I don't think that's the intention, but I do think it's often the outcome. And I think definitely the culture encourages you, hey, be accepting, be Jesus-like, make sure that you accept people. However, and I think we'll come to this as we explore this a bit further, is it does become more of a tool, I think, later on, because what happens is you get love bombed. And then if you start going outside the bounds of what is seen acceptable in that particular community, the love bombing, it backs off. And your acceptance backs off, and it's Pavlov's dog. You understand that if you behave a certain way, you'll get more acceptance, you'll get more love, you'll get more belonging. You don't, you're on the outer. So you start to then exhibit these behaviours which are more socially acceptable in that circle. And hey, that happens in society too, but that doesn't have eternal consequences in society. So it's quite different, I think. But I want to go to you, and because for you, you went to a revival centre camp, so very different experience. I mean, you were very immersed. What was your initial thoughts or impressions of the people at the camp, and what are your thoughts around love bombing that happened there, or was there love bombing?
Yeah. Again, I don't know that it was intentional. As much as I was just really lovable. No, I just think that's what they do to new people. I think there's an aspect to it where the culture sets a norm that we're really good to the new people, and that we make sure that we take them in, that sort of mentality. So I think that's a big part of it. But they definitely did treat me so well, and I was definitely super excited by the whole welcoming vibe, and especially putting it into perspective that I was feeling really rejected back at school, and I didn't feel like I belonged. And it wasn't that I didn't have friends, and it wasn't that I didn't have some good friends. It was just that the whole cultural thing of not feeling like I really belonged in Canberra. And yeah, that was pretty rough, I have to say.
Is there any specific examples that you can think of where that really stood out to you that went, wow, these people really accept me?
I can remember he wasn't a pastor, but he was like a kids leader because it was a kids camp. But he was an adult. And I can remember this guy, I got up and did a skit with some kids, and it was a lot of fun and everything. And then afterwards, the guy got up and he grabbed the mic and he said, and he looked at me, and everyone knew he was talking to me. And he says, "Isn't he great? Isn't he just great?" Like this. And it was just like, oh, and at the time it was like, oh, I'm great. Oh, now I look back and go, fucking manipulation, like that's just intense. Who does that? In front of all the kids, he was telling them that I was awesome. And yeah, that meant something to me. That was impactful.
Absolutely. Yeah, especially at that age, 13 or 14, it makes you stand out, feel special when you haven't necessarily felt special or accepted. Perfect.
Yeah, and especially with what I was going through, All right, mate. I've got a question for you. Moving on, right, with the idea of feeling at home and feeling that you were a part of something. You mentioned feeling at home in the AOG, right? Which was Great Big AOG, as we call it. What was it about that community that fostered that feeling? And how important was that sense of belonging to you at that time?
Yeah, and look, there was a church just before that where I felt incredibly embraced, and it was, for me, that was probably the first community. And look, I'll say the name of it. It was called Reach Out Christian Centre. It was in Warrenwood in Victoria, and still to this day, I am friends with many people there, and I love them dearly. Some have remained Christians, some have not, but even the ones that have completely still accept me. I think they're just genuinely good humans. And I think I grew so much as a person there. I owe a lot to that place because it helped me come out of my shell. It helped me understand who I was. And I'm not saying who I was in God or anything like that, although that was a lot of the focus there. But for me, I understood more deeply about myself. I became probably more emotionally intelligent as well, more aware of who I was in relation to the world, but also within the context of who I was in relation to God and the bigger picture. And for that, I definitely...
I'm triggering when you talk like this, Brian. I'm not used to you talking who I was in God. It's like, oh my God.
Yeah, and I guess I'm just trying to use the context of what it was back then.
Yeah. I get that.
And now I look at it and I go, yeah, whatever. I don't believe any of it. But I think for me, it was even through those things, I just think I became a different person and I grew so much. And I think that was incredibly important. But I think I outgrew that space. And that's when I ended up at Great Big AOG. And
but before you did, right, or even after you joined Great Big AOG, did you notice a shift in your social circles towards the church community and away from your other friends?
I did. I had pretty much no non-Christian mates from a few months in at that church. And just as a reminder for people who haven't heard the episode for a long time, I drifted for probably 18 months after that conversion up on the Gold Coast with my brother, and my other brother actually moved back down to Victoria. Part of it, he was concerned about me because I wasn't going to church. I was still hanging out with my old mates. And then we explored a few churches together and ended up landing at Reach Out Christian Centre. And we both felt like it was, the place for us, and we went there. But probably...
It wasn't really close to home, though, either. That was a bit of a drive for you.
Warrenwood
from Blackburn.
Yeah, probably 20 minutes, 25 minutes. So it wasn't close. We tried out ones closer, just didn't
Because you had Blackburn
work.
Baptist just up the road, mate.
Yeah.
And Blackburn North Baptist, that's got a new name, but that's another one. That you had some churches around you.
Yeah, Blackburn North Baptist now is like a Star Wars church, New Hope. But that one was literally 200 meters from our home, but we tried that one out. It was one we tried out, but also let's not forget I'd become a Pentecostal. So speaking about
And
Baptist,
also, in fairness, New Hope wasn't what it is now.
No,
not back
it
then.
wasn't.
It was just a small little Baptist church on the corner, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It was garden variety. So we did try it, and we walked in and it was just like, oh, this is too traditional. But yeah, probably within 3 months of being at Reach Out, I don't think I was seeing any of my mates who weren't Christians. I'd definitely become part of that community, and that doubled down by the time I got to Great Big AOG, because I think that place was massive too. Like, it had a youth group in the hundreds. So you didn't actually need to socialise outside it. And that was much further from my home. That was, probably not much further. It was probably about the same, about half an hour or so. But people, as we spoke about before, came from all across Melbourne to go to that place. So your social circle became even bigger. It can be right across Melbourne that you're socialising with people. But again, my world got smaller in that I became completely enveloped within that space, but it still felt big because it was such a big, youth group, congregation. There were so many opportunities, I guess. And my world definitely did shrink as much as I thought it expanded. And my worldview shrank as well, because that is what I was referring to before, that you start to get that reinforcement of good behaviour, and equally you get reinforcement of unacceptable behaviour very fast. And because it was such an environment, and it was dynamic environment, that if you were in that space and you wanted to belong, you are going to behave in the way that is acceptable. So unconsciously, my behaviour was changing. I was becoming a lot more strict, I guess, in my my Christianity. Before I was a bit more liberal, but this became very, very tight. So it was definitely an interesting time. So, but I want to go to you.
The power of belonging, formation of community. This, we can look back on our, stories and see that these models are pointing to this. And yeah, it was there.
Absolutely, it was there. And I think it became more intentional the deeper I got in. Or maybe I'm being kinder to those people early in my journey, but it certainly felt like it was becoming more intentional. And I probably even had little, dare I say, little revelations about that myself, where I understood that what was happening, and I'd start to question some of that stuff. And that's where, for me, it was probably the beginning of the undoing, which took several years. But for you, you've gone on that revival centre camp. You've got that initial hook into that community. There's a promise of all those, fun things you're going to do. And also, let's go back to, you already had your interest peaked around speaking in tongues through charismatic. Yes.
That's what it sounded like at first. I remember, because I came home and my brother said to me, he goes, do it. And I did this, and he goes, you're just saying giddalum, giddalum, giddalum. Yeah, it was like, the Lone Ranger. Giddalum, 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 lum, lum. Yep.
That's what came to mind as soon as you started doing it. I thought, we're going Lone Ranger. All that stuff that I guess you're promised, and that made you feel part of that group, or let's say cult. How significant for you was that desire of belonging and to be accepted with that new group of people, and what were some of the drivers?
It was funny because they had this experience of speaking in tongues that made you a Christian, right? And this was the difference between the revival centers. They're a lot like the more global group that teaches that are the United Pentecostal Church and other oneness groups. So they were teaching that, and so they had this sort of tangible experience, this sort of gate that you stepped through, and you became part of the group. So I think there was definitely a feeling of worthiness and belonging. Remember the guy saying, "Isn't he great?" And even so, that God gave me that gift. And so, yeah, it definitely, in those early days, I felt an increased sense of worth and belonging in the revival centers. It tapped into that right away.
So in terms of the presentation of tongues to you, what sort of importance came with that? Was that something that was central to, purity and holiness and being a real Christian? How was that presented to you?
Oh, totally. It was, like I said, it was the gateway, it was the barrier, it was what separated us from everybody else. And, I didn't know about Pentecostalism. I didn't know that there was Assemblies of God and, United Pentecostal Church and revival centers. I didn't know any of that. This was just me touching God, and these people happened to be there. And when I did get that experience, well, then all of a sudden, oh, you've got that experience too. Yes, welcome. You're just like us now. And so it became a brand of belonging. It was a symbol. And it was interesting because when I went back to school, I remember I bumped into, I started talking to another girl who was at school who said, "Oh yeah, I speak in tongues." And I was like, "What, really? Why didn't you ever tell me? Why didn't you ever tell me about it?" But they didn't have the same, this is what separates us from absolutely everybody else. Yes, it separates us from the world, but it doesn't separate us from other Christians. Whereas in the revival center, all the Christians out there that didn't speak in tongues, they weren't real Christians. So it was about being real. It was about being a real, authentic part of the in club, 100%. It was very much an indicator of being in the in group.
Yeah. Which, it's all that stuff around high control groups. Like, we're going to give you something special and you'll display something special and hold on to that something special. And then we can keep you involved and control you from there. So there's a lot of stuff happening, I think, behind the scenes in that was sort of like a key indicator of Christianity for you.
Totally. And I think that's why tongues for me was always a thing. But we'll come back to that. But hey, you mentioned that the group you joined just after your holiday, was that Reach Out?
No, just after my holiday, it was actually, so I became a Christian in a Christian city church. It was in Currumbin in Queensland on the Gold Coast. And when I came back, there was a couple of little startups, and there was two that were within probably 10 minutes drive of my house that were church plants from Christian City. And there was a pastor from Sydney who'd actually been sent down to Melbourne to plant a couple of churches, and I ended up at his church, and it was tiny. Like, there was probably, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 people, which actually dwindled down to not many. And I was definitely not committed. There was a bunch of people there that weren't committed. And I think I've said this in a previous episode, that the pastor actually called me and he said, it's people like you that are to blame for this church shutting down. I was like, yeah, okay. In hindsight, awesome.
And you were 17, because of course.
I was 17, yeah. At that stage, I would have been close to 18 at that stage. But there was also a bunch of other young people there. There was probably 5 or 6, but I never caught up with them outside of going there on a Sunday. But they'd all come so hungover. One of them was one of the church leaders' daughter. They'd come so hungover on a Sunday morning. So again, none of them were committed. And I think he was really trying to connect with what was a traditional Christian City brand back then, which is, hey, come one, come all. You can be a little bit feral, and that's totally okay, because, we had our roots as a surfy type church, but it didn't work. It was in Melbourne. So a very different scene. And from there, and that's where I drifted. And I probably had a year to 18 months where I didn't really go anywhere. I'd bump in and out of places, and every now and then I'd feel guilty, so I would line somewhere up and I'd go.
Yeah, you actually said that you had to get through the Sunday service to get to the social aspect. And I can relate to that too. I used to sit there through the Revival Centre meetings, just can't wait for dinner, and then we all go out, or we all, sit around and eat dinner. But looking back, how were the group's core beliefs and expectations, subtly or not so subtly, communicated in those early days, and I'm thinking about, controlled environments. That's basically what I'm sort of looking at in terms of the models of high control religions. So how did that behavior control extend to you and your behavior? But what about things like media consumption and, implicit or explicit limitations on what information you are able to consume?
Yeah, look, I think that first 12 to 18 months, I didn't have a great deal of guidance around that or boundaries. And I didn't really even think about what I watched or what I listened to and how that would affect me being a Christian, because the place I'd become a Christian, that really wasn't a thing. People, my brother had talked to me about Christian music and all that, but he also loved other music, and so really, it wasn't an issue. It wasn't until my other brother moved down to Melbourne that he started to really impose upon me the idea that if I listened to this worldly music, then that would affect me and it would negatively affect my faith journey. And he would, rip tapes out of my tape deck in my car and put Christian ones in while we were driving. He'd tell me that, I had to start consuming more church type stuff and God type stuff, and basically we are what we eat. And I got lots and lots of that reinforced. When I went to reach out with him, they weren't as strict and they were pretty good like that. They were pretty accepting. Everyone would listen to worldly music, I guess. However, things did become a bit more constricted in that there was the expectation of Saturday youth. There was Sunday service. Definitely don't be a spiritual oncer. So you rock up morning, night. So all of a sudden, I'm having my opportunity restricted to go out to, I used to go out and see bands every Saturday night. That's what I do with mates. All of a sudden, that was reduced. And sure, you'd see a band, but it was at youth group. So there was a very different sense, but that ramped up at Great Big OOG, where it was very much frowned upon. You could not consume stuff that wasn't Christian, and that included books. That was even very much self-monitoring and monitoring by others about what you watched, the movies, and you were told, there were certain movies you wouldn't go and see because they'd influence you. The music was a big thing, and that was a point in my life where I started to explore more Christian music because I soon found out that you couldn't listen to worldly music.
No, and you couldn't. And fair enough, because it'd drag you down to hell.
Yeah, absolutely it would.
Which is what it does. Hey, I've got another question for you.
Yeah.
Coming back to your conversion.
Yeah.
When you gave your life to Jesus, as you said it this time, but you also said it in our original recording, you said you felt like you weren't entirely in control and more like you were being drawn to it than choosing it.
Yeah.
Now, considering what we've discussed over the last 4 years about emotional influence and also today about the desire for belonging, how might you interpret that feeling differently now? And what part did the music and the emotion and the atmosphere play in drawing you, and how aware were you of that at that time? A lot of questions there.
No, look, and the first thing that came to mind before you even started with saying what you said was the music, the atmosphere. Lights were down, keyboard was on, lots of low speaking, slow speaking, soothing, all of those sort of things. I wasn't aware of it at the time. I definitely didn't think that this was having an influence on me, but I was drawn, and there was definitely a manipulative factor in coaxing you down to the front. And it wasn't, hey, come down and your life is going to be changed because we're going to make you listen to different music. You're not going to be able to associate with people outside of the church. It was all, hey, come down. God loves you. You're accepted. People are here, but give your life to this, because when you give your life to it, things are going to be so much better.
Yeah, you don't know what you're signing up for. You're just believing them, what they're telling you in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I fell for that. And I remember afterwards, it was really interesting. So I went down the front, prayed the sinner's prayer. I think I said it in the recording that we did, that the pastor said to me, hey, that's better than getting stoned, isn't it? And no, it wasn't. But it was, it was all right. But I remember once all that had happened, I went straight outside and needed a cigarette, because I was just like, I've been hanging out. I've been in this church for an hour and a quarter or an hour and a half, and I needed a smoke. And my brother came out to me and goes, I thought you would have been healed from that. I was like, okay, I didn't even understand what he was trying to say. But I was like, yeah, no, I felt like a cigarette. And it was probably a similar pull that pulled me up the front. I just felt like it was going to be soothing, like the cigarette after I became a Christian. It was soothing to go up the front. And for someone who's relatively introverted, such as myself, I didn't even feel it a challenge to walk out the front of, several hundred people. So there was something about it that just drew me in. It made me feel safe, and it made me feel like things were going to be better if I just went up and followed wherever this was going to go.
Yeah, interesting about that, because you did talk about the package of being baptized and also speaking in tongues, which is funny because that's how it was presented in the Revival Centre. It's like you do all of this. This is all the package, and you can see where it's sort of come from because you had the same sort of experience. But in terms of that, did you think about it? Like, did you think about the baptism? Did you think about speaking in tongues, or did you just go with the flow?
That wasn't up front. I had my brother had spoke to me about tongues. I said, all right, speak in tongues in front of me then. And he did.
Get alum, get alum, get alum.
Did alum. He did. He went up full Lone Ranger. But that was before I'd gone to church with him. So for me, that was sort of part of the convincing. For some reason, I thought, oh my God, this is legit. He's got this other language. Not long after it was probably within a day, I had to be coached to speak in tongues. I had to actually do the whole copying. I remember I was in the back of a HQ holding, and my brother was in the front, and his mate was in the front, and my brother turned around, and he was coaching me, repeat after me, repeat after me. And then I was going home like maybe 3 or 4 days later, and they convinced me to stay until the following weekend so they could take me down to one of the rivers and baptize me. And the pastor, and they said, you have to, like, this is actually part of it. You have to do this. These are your three
Very
things.
80s to be baptized in a river, by the way.
Very 80s, in a pair of fluoro orange board shorts, but
Nice.
with a horrible mullet, and a bowl cut mullet was the worst of the 80s. But it was the package of saying that sinner's prayer. You've got to speak in tongues, and you've got to be baptized. And I had to do all that within the span of the week before I went back to Melbourne. And they were convinced that that would just keep me on the right track. So I think those were the sort of things which were packaged up. I felt that if I did them, that I would be part of the group. And if I did them, I'd also, because by then I'm like, hey, now I get to heaven. Not everyone gets there. I'm part of this exclusive club that gets in there. But so yeah, lots of similarities, I think, around those sort of things, because you also were very coached around speaking in tongues, and obviously you've spoken about that, the importance of it for you. You also said that it didn't really feel that spontaneous. I can definitely relate to that. But how did that experience, I guess, shape your idea of that spiritual authenticity?
Well, yeah, it was definitely coached, and it's funny how people used to say that to me when I was a Pentecostal. They say, "Oh, you teach people to speak in tongues." It's like, no one taught me to speak in tongues. No, but then when you stop and remember, what they mean by teach you to speak in tongues is, say hallelujah over and over again, or just let it go, let your tongue change, and all that kind of stuff. And that's what they mean by coached. It wasn't spontaneous. And I know some people tell stories of it hitting them spontaneously, but it's very, very rare that they're not primed in some way for tongues. I don't want to get ahead of myself because we are going to do that episode. But I guess for me, there was a manipulation of that experience, but there was also a strong manipulation through the music. Like even in the Revival Centre, which don't raise your hands and sway and all that kind of stuff. But even with the fast music, and remember when we had Tom Tilley on and there was all the clapping and the syncopated clapping and you're a part of something, it's all that sort of choral singing and group experience and all that kind of stuff. And so there was an elation. It wasn't like later in the AOG sort of Hillsong stuff where it was all that ooh ah, as I call it. It was more this, yeah, great. Yes, I will sing unto the Lord for he, and all this kind of stuff. So I think there was definitely, I don't think it was intentional in the sense that they're like, oh, we're going to manipulate them now. But I think it's like, it's a learned behavior that we all feel good when we do this, when we sing these songs and when we, clap in syncopation and all that. So yeah, I mean, the idea of emotional manipulation from some of these cult models, definitely 100%. But I had no idea. And it wasn't just about being 13, 14. I think also, I didn't have an understanding of this stuff like I do now, but yes, it was definitely there.
Yeah. So the emotions were definitely part of what led you to get caught up in it, do you think?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. But as I'm saying, it wasn't about this sort of spooky ooh-ah in the Revival Centre. It was the feeling of happiness and elation and excitement. And, it was really cool. at least the feeling. Another thing that you mentioned is you didn't like telling your friends. You know, we talk about, are you a Brian Christian? Are you a Troy Christian? Troy tells everyone, Brian tells no one. So you were you said you felt incredibly awkward about wearing the Christian label, and yet you're being drawn in, and yet you're being, you're feeling a part of something. What was going on with that? And try and talk through and think about how it was at the time, that on the one hand, you're feeling a part of something, you're belonging to something. And on the other hand, there's a part of you that's going, I don't want to tell anyone, I don't want to be here. That's intense, because I didn't feel that. Not initially, at least.
That internal conflict was very real, and I remember it vividly. Remember, in the 80s, we grew up in the era of the Christian Television Association. So Christian ads were so cringy. They were on television, but also on radio. You would make fun of them because they were just incredibly cringy, awkward. The kids were dorks, which,
Or they had like puppets, and the puppets would come on, or remember there was the one, and they had this huge butterfly, and it was like they were flying the butterfly around. It was like a big marionette puppet thing. It was just so Anglican.
Oh, and that's what I associated with Christianity. And I knew that's what my mates associated with Christianity. And a lot of mainstream Australia looked at them and went, oh my God, that's what a Christian. So for me, I thought, I'm part of something different. I'm not part of that. I'm part of this movement. So why couldn't I actually communicate it to people? Some of it was, I knew the way not long ago I'd looked at it, and I was just like, oh my God, I don't think I can actually convince people that that's not what it is, because on the surface, a lot of the stuff that was in those commercials and, ebbing its way into mainstream media, that's what it was like. And I didn't relate to it because I didn't feel that's what I was involved with, but I knew that's what people would think and associate when I spoke to them about it. But also deep down, I don't know if I was convinced about the message of Christianity, but I was convinced about community, and I was convinced about belonging, and I was convinced that these were good people with good intent, and I'm being generous because not all of them were, but in the main, I think most of them were. But the message for me didn't always ring true. I had so many doubts. Even when I went to Bible college, I had so many doubts. I was like, yeah, but like, surely this isn't surely some of this is just stories. Surely some of this didn't happen. So I think I had all that conflict happening, but mostly I was just deeply embarrassed. I was deeply embarrassed that I'd become a Christian, and because I'd also been so anti as well. And when my brothers had become Christians before me, I remember just going, how the fuck could you ever do that? How could you ever believe in this? It's a fairy tale. It's rubbish. It doesn't align with anything we were brought up with, and it doesn't align with anything that resembles reality. So I think there was just this deep embarrassment. I just didn't have it in me to actually talk to people about it. And even you'll remember when we started this podcast, I still wasn't out there evangelizing the podcast and saying, because that would mean that I'd have to own up to that's what I was. Back then, I was one of them. And it was difficult. It was difficult. Now I don't care. I'm
Maybe
happy.
We should have called it He Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. And then you could have just, said, yeah, I do this podcast called He Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. Could have been about me.
Yeah, I know. It was absolutely it was a bizarre time, and I think I still find it difficult to work out exactly what it was that I was embarrassed about and why I wouldn't actually tell anyone, despite the fact that I was told that I had to tell people about it. Otherwise, I wasn't necessarily a real Christian, because you had to evangelize people. So
yeah, that's right. It's not enough to repent, be baptized, and speak in tongues. You've got to do all this other shit too.
Oh, absolutely. So yeah, tough time. And I think that was why it was probably an easier path for me to take when I got involved in the church, to just become immersed in that and not hang out with my old non-Christian mates, because it was just less confronting. And and that later on played into the fact that I wanted to be a career Christian by becoming a pastor, because I was like, I can just immerse myself within this and I can just speak to the flock and it's not threatening, because I don't have to go out and justify what I believe when I deep down probably just don't believe it enough or at all to be able to tell others why they should believe it. So I think that was, a lot of complexity sitting there with me. Trauma is coming back. No, it's actually not. I don't feel trauma from this at all. I just feel confusion and who was I? Maybe I lost my way for a while and then became it so deep that it became my identity and I didn't know how to get out of it until I got divorced. So for you, you're recruited into the revival centres at 13. That whole stuff we've been referring to throughout this episode around that coercion, conversion, control. It targets the young. You fit the bill there. You're 13 years old. So reflecting on your experience, do you see similarities between how you were drawn in to those experiences and those of individuals raised within high control religious environments who might not have had that pre-conversion outside, that perspective that sat outside of the cult?
Yeah, that's something that I've reflected on a lot as we've made this podcast, because I think about the people that were raised in it as opposed to people like us that were converted. And we do have different experiences to a point. One of the tells for me was I could always go home, and I didn't realize that I could just go home and leave it all there. Whereas a lot of these kids that, were the same age as me, they went home and they were living it. It was inside their house. They weren't allowed to watch these TV shows, listen to this music, all that kind of stuff, whereas I didn't have any of that. And I didn't realize at the time that that was a thing that I was able to do until I was on still in the revival center. I was on a camp and I had this, do you remember the Scholastic Book Club? Used to fill a thing and take it to school and then wait 4 to 6 weeks and then your books would come and, So I had these horror novels for young adults. So I was about, 14, 15, and I had these horror novels and I was on this camp and I was reading it. And then this pastor's wife on this youth camp came up to me and she goes, "Why are you reading that?" And I'm like, "Oh, it's just a book, kind of thing." I didn't even realize it was a thing at that stage because I'd been raised in it. And she goes, "Oh, it's not really good for spirit-filled people to be reading these kinds of books." And I was just like, "What?" And I didn't even know it was a bad thing. I was reading about like demonic possession and shit, as the Scholastic Book Club would sell. It was, I think for me, that was really the first time that someone had actually put it on me. And it became much more intense later on, especially as I got older. But I think the fact that I could go home and get away from it, or go to school and get away from it. And I guess a lot of kids that are involved in churches, still can go to schools when you're not homeschooled and sort of get away from it to a degree, unless you've got other church kids who dob on you and stuff at the same school, right? So, yeah, so I think there's very much a difference in our experience. I mean, look, it's really deep, and I think we could actually do a whole episode on the difference between being raised in it and brought into it. But the fact that I was a teenage fundamentalist is not lost on me, Brian, because they were such impactful years, and I think for me, and also for you, because, I know your story so well, there's an intentional focus on the younger people to bring them in. And when you think about, like, I think it was Billy Graham that said, after 25 or 26, whatever the age he said, there's not a lot of hope for these people. And it's like, well, if this is the gospel, if this is really, the message of Jesus Christ, why is it that it doesn't work so well when you grow up? That's just insane. So I've got a question for you then, and that is, what differences might exist in long-term impact and the process of leaving compared to people who were, I guess, not so vulnerable, right? So we were vulnerable and we were brought in. Did that keep us there?
Yeah, look, I think the vulnerability kept me there. And as I said, I got some good stuff out of it. I definitely did. But for me, longer term, the stuff that kept me there is that I was in so deep in that it was my whole social structure. I had a lot to lose by leaving, which I guess ties back into a vulnerability, because you're vulnerable in that if you leave, you lose what you've built there, and you lose what you've actually, in some ways, worked hard to create, and others have created in you, because people do invest in you. And sometimes it's through an informal or a formal mentoring relationship with people, or it's the fact that those friendships do have a depth to it. Because I think one thing, when I think about some of my relationships and friendships within the church, I think by the very nature that you're there for eternal purposes, your conversations became deep relatively fast, and probably deeper than they would in everyday relationships that you meet people out in the community through your football club, at the pub or whatever. Generally, there was a depth to it. And because of that, I think that increased the vulnerability, because you had laid yourself bare before others, and people knew things about you that many others didn't, because of the safety of that environment, or at least the perceived safety of that environment. What do you reckon for you?
I mean, look, I don't think that if I had been as vulnerable, I just wouldn't have been sucked in as easily, if I hadn't have been in such a place of vulnerability. So, and I think that also happened later on when I ended up joining the AOG, because that was another point of vulnerability. But I think it's fair to say that if I'd been older and more established in my identity, I don't think I would have been as susceptible. So it was, the perfect storm. They came along right at the right time. And so I was more susceptible to the recruitment tactics because of vulnerability, because of age. And again, it's not lost on me that this is called I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist, because I don't think we would be making a podcast. If this had come our way at 25 or 30, I just don't think it would have happened.
It's interesting though. Look, I think about my siblings. So there was 5 of us that converted to fundamentalist Christianity. I was the last and the youngest. All the others converted in their 20s, and for a couple of my sisters, they were probably closer to their late 20s, early 30s. So I wonder what it was for them that led.
It does
them.
Happen. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but
No, not for us, because we were teenage fundamentalists, as you said. But I just wonder if the pulls are different for people, because I know if I think of my 2 sisters, for them it came at a time of high vulnerability, because they were both going through divorce at the time. One of my brothers, both my brothers actually, there was definitely external factors which led them to probably become more vulnerable, which I won't go into because they're relatively personal stories of theirs. But definitely my sisters were going through divorce, and they got converted. They also got converted in a weird way through the New Age movement as well. So they got sucked into the New Age movement through that vulnerability. So the golden thread is definitely vulnerability.
Yeah, I think that's true. Hey, look, I'm just thinking about time. We're well over an hour. So why don't we think about sort of wrapping up? Looking ahead for this season and what's coming up, are there any specific aspects of our involvement, whether recruitment or later involvement, that you're keen to re-examine? Now, because, we did all those episodes early on, right? We did conversion, we did tongues, we did miracles, we did all that sort of stuff. But it may not be any of those. But is there anything that you want to explore this season?
Yeah, definitely. I think we're going to dive into tongues a little bit because we did do an episode, but it was
Get a
relatively
lum, get a lum, get a lum, get a lum.
it was
I'm just diving
relatively
into tongues now. Get a lum, get a
early.
lum.
Oh, shunda, shunda. Um, it
See, that's
was
AOG. That's
oh,
AOG. Revival Centre. Get a lum, get a lum, get a lum.
totally different musical tones, but we did do an episode early, but we skimmed the surface, and I think definitely the book that you've been reading around tongues, really looking forward to getting a guest on who it's their expertise and getting them to speak to it. And us, I think we'll learn a lot from that too, because some of that historical stuff we definitely didn't dive into in our episode. It was very experiential, and we spoke about how, we were introduced to tongues, and I think it was a very Pentecostal experience, and we will find out more around the origins and also some of the beliefs around that. So I think that'll be really interesting. I would like to, and I don't even know how it would look, but one thing that's come up through this episode for both of us is community and the part that it played. And again, we did do an episode on it, and we spoke about the importance of community, and also that it was very much the glue that kept us there for potentially longer than we would have stayed. I mean, if the community, you can see if the community becomes dysfunctional through a church split, for example, many people leave. They find that opportunity to slip out the back door, much like when I left and you left as a result of divorce. We took the opportunity to step out as well. So I think those things definitely do happen when community is dysfunctional. So I just wonder around the function of community within the Christian context and what it means and how it looks. So I'd like to explore those. How about you? What are the things that you would like to cover?
Interesting about community. I actually think I was addicted to community, and I don't use that word flippantly. I think there was an addiction because when I had it taken away, God, I nearly fell over. It was intense. I don't know, man. What things do I want to explore? I think it would be interesting to talk about miracles and stuff. Just thinking about like the Benny Hinn stuff, and what about the miracles that people claim did in fact happen, and there's some sort of evidence for, and because I remember Tara Jean Stevens on her Heaven Bent one, she talked about that there is actually evidence of these people in Africa being healed, and so what do you do with that? I'd like to sort of talk about that and sort of look into that. I mean, I don't think my initial reaction is it wasn't real, even if there is evidence. But anyway, we'll see. So I don't know. I think I'd like to have a look at that. I think we've got a lot more to say about sex. I think we did a couple of episodes on sex, and that was it. So I think that's definitely a topic to explore. But I think what I think is valuable, and this may not be valuable to all our listeners. We may lose listeners as we do this, but revisiting these 4 years later and revisiting these topics 4 years later, and what perspectives have we drawn? What views have changed? Not just for when it happened then, but just even in the last 4 years. And I think that's going to be quite interesting. Did we shift? Because that I sort of got a little bit open to spiritual things for a while, and now I'm closed again. We're humans, and we grow and we change. So, yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to look back on some of these things.
Yeah, and look, I think if I scratch the surface with myself, I'm always looking for meaning, and I think meaning for me though isn't necessarily a spirituality these days. Some may frame it as a spirituality, but what is meaning, and what is meaning in a context outside of Christianity? And how do we actually find that? How do we identify with it? We know that there's not one truth. So how do we actually, how do we contextualize who we are, where we're going, and does it even matter? So for some people, it just might not matter because there's the here and the now and they're living life. But for some people, they need some sort of greater good or connected into their community, society, doing something to serve others, alongside others, with others, whatever. I think I'd like to unpack that a bit more. And for me, it's probably a little bit of projection because I work in an industry which is identified as a helping industry. I mean, I work alongside professionals we've all studied either psychology, social work, or community development, or whatever it be. So is that the expression that people are exploring there? So let's dig into some of that stuff. We've also got guests that we're exploring right now coming on. We've got a couple of books that people have flicked our way. I'd also love to connect with Bart Ehrman again. So Bart Ehrman has just, I think it'll be launched very, very soon, a book around the origins of altruism. So, and he's basically arguing that modern altruism has its roots in Christianity, which I think is going to be really interesting to read that book. So we'll get hold of that. We'll get the publisher to send us a copy of that, and hopefully get Bart on in the next few months as well.
Yeah, well, don't sell it too strong, because who knows, right? He's a big deal. He may not come on our show this time, but fingers crossed. Let's hope we can get him on. Hey, Brian, as we close this episode, is there anything burning that you want to talk about in terms of your conversion? Like looking back now, 50-something years old, looking back on that time, what's your take on it?
My take still remains the same, in that I don't think it was a wasted time of my life. I learned a lot through it. The actual time of conversion, for me, I definitely do think there was a lot of coercion. There was a lot of control. There was tapping into the fact that I was ripe. I was at a very vulnerable time in my life, because you could line up maybe 20 17-year-olds and we wouldn't all have the same experience. So there were different aspects of priming, which I think led me to become involved at that age. And because it was a time where I was seeking belonging, once I got involved in that, and then became part of my identity, it was very difficult to extract myself from it, which led me to obviously marry someone who was in it, stay in it longer than I should have, explore how I could stay in it by legitimizing it through going to Bible college and professionalizing my Christianity, all of those sort of things. But ultimately, I think the hardest thing was extracting myself from the community and then connecting myself in with another community afterwards, and really having to recreate your life, because it's easy to stay. It's easy to just keep drifting along. What about you? When you look back at your conversion and that time, that weird and wonderful stuff happening, what are some of your reflections?
The word of the day is vulnerability, right? I mean, that's something that we've really drawn on in this episode, and really sort of shown that we were in vulnerable states. Doesn't mean that we were bad people, broken people. We were just vulnerable. And, that window might have been a number of months. That window might have been a number of years. That window might have been a number of weeks. Who knows? But for us, we were at a vulnerable stage. And part of it, I think, was our external factors pushing on us. Like, for example, me, coming back to Australia and feeling alone and, disconnected. And then part of it was just, normal rites of passage, when you talk about just being 17 and feeling like you didn't quite fit and all that. So I think it's interesting that being vulnerable doesn't make you weak or a bad person, or, somehow, you know what I'm saying? Weak, yeah. I guess is the real word. It's not about being a weak person. It's about being in a weak state, which, you can pass through. And it's again coming through that gate that they close it behind you, and you may pass through that vulnerable stage, but too late. You're trapped like Venus flytrap. So, that's why I think they're really dangerous, and that's why I also think they shouldn't be in schools. And I really, applaud the people that campaign against the chaplains being in schools, and the church groups being able to run religious education and all this in the government schools. I think it does matter. And it's not about being anti-Christian. I think it's true of any religion. They shouldn't be allowed in schools. So, and my story, if you're interested, if you haven't listened to our stories, you can go back and listen to episodes 1 and 2. It was the school that was instrumental, and the groups within schools. So yeah, I think that vulnerability and just being young, and being primed just by being young.
Yeah, absolutely. And those vulnerabilities pop up throughout people's lives. I've lost count of the amount of people that I've seen who've left church, then something's happened in their life, like they do get unwell, and when that's mentally or physically, and they drift back to the church because, again, in that time of vulnerability, they're offered that safety, that community, that connectedness. And again, it is the word of the day. It's that vulnerability, and whether there's an intentional preying on that or not, it's there and it's capitalized.
Yeah, agreed, man. Agreed. Well, there we go. End of episode 1 for season 6, which is just insane. Has it actually been 5 years, not 4 years?
No, it's been 4 years. This is our 5th year. Remember, we crammed in 40 episodes.
Okay, yeah, so
and
we're starting
2 seasons.
season 6. We're not ending season 6. So yeah. So it's been 4 years. But yeah, it's hey man, we've been doing this for a while. Let's see how much longer we can do it.
But they can see us now, so you can see us,
which is amazing.
So hello. Welcome to my home office. I'm just broadcasting from my home.
Welcome to my son's bedroom, by the way. This is not my room. I don't have, all this kind of stuff in my room. But yeah, welcome to my son's bedroom.
Hey, no judgment. No.
All right, mate. I'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
You will. 2 weeks or a fortnight.
Yeah. Bye.
If you'd like to connect with the I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist podcast, then please see the links in our link tree in the show notes. We invite you to join our listener community on Facebook, and we're also on Instagram, X, and Reddit. Check out our merch on Redbubble. We've got t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, and all kinds of great evangelical stuff that you can wear proudly. All proceeds go to building and promoting the podcast. We want to give a huge shout out to our Patreon supporters. Subscribers get a range of benefits, including free merch, early access to episodes, access to our exclusive subscribers group, and monthly bonus content. Again, all proceeds of this go to the running and promotion costs of the podcast. A special thanks to Ava, who manages our social strategy, and also to Kerry and Bree, who manage our Facebook listener group, and also to Bree, who puts out our monthly newsletter on Substack. All of our episodes are transcribed by Leanne to increase accessibility. The show is produced and hosted by Brian McDowell and Troy Waller. The sound engineering for this episode was done by Beck Wise. I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist is available wherever you find your podcasts. Again, you can find all our links in our link tree in the show notes. Or why don't you pop across to our website at www.iwasateenagefundamentalist.com.